He started a band that sings songs about pizza. She spent 9 years under another person's legal control, unable to make her own financial decisions. He got an Oscar nomination at age 11, one of the youngest in history, and then deliberately walked away from the screen himself. One of them turned a childhood role into $100 million a year fashion business. And story number one on this list is a fate so intense that it changed the way Hollywood itself talks about protecting children in the industry. Today, we're counting down 8 of the most famous child stars of the 90s and 2000s, from simply interesting to genuinely shocking. I guarantee you don't know the full story behind at least half of these. Stay until the end, because number one is not what most people remember. Before we start, I want you to actually imagine this for a second. You're 10 years old. Every single person on the street recognizes your face. Strangers already know your name before you've even introduced yourself. You're being paid millions of dollars while your classmates are still counting change at the ice cream stand. On paper, it sounds like the ultimate childhood dream. But here's the thing almost nobody tells you. Childhood fame doesn't just disappear when the cameras stop rolling. It follows you into your 20s, your 30s, sometimes for the rest of your life. Some of the people on this list found a way to use that fame as a launch pad. Others spent years trying to escape it, and at least one of them had to fight, quite literally, to get their own life back. We're doing this as a countdown, from number 8 to number 1, and I promise the stories only get bigger from here. If you're ready, hit like right now, and let's start with number 8. Number 8, Jonathan Taylor Thomas, the boy who walked away at the peak of fame. If you lived through the 1990s, you absolutely saw Jonathan Taylor Thomas's face, and not just occasionally. He was everywhere. Teen magazine covers, posters, lunchboxes, you name it. He played the middle son, Randy Taylor, on the massively popular family sitcom Home Improvement, one of the highest-rated shows on American television at the time. On top of that, he voiced young Simba in Disney's original, hand-drawn Lion King, a film that would go on to become one of the highest-grossing animated movies ever made. By the mid-90s, industry insiders genuinely believed Thomas was on track to become one of the defining leading men of his generation. He had the sitcom fame, the box office pedigree, and the magazine cover popularity that usually adds up to decades of stardom. And then, almost as quickly as it began, he pulled back. After his 1998 film I'll Be Home for Christmas underperformed at the box office, Thomas made a decision that very few young actors at his level of fame ever make. He chose his own exit. He began turning down major roles, one after another, and shifted his focus toward his education instead. This is really the first small mystery of this entire video. Why would someone at the absolute peak of their career voluntarily choose to disappear? For Thomas, the answer wasn't scandal, and it wasn't a falling out with the industry. It was simply a personal decision about the kind of life he wanted to live. He attended college, studied history, and spent years living largely outside the entertainment world entirely. Today, Thomas occasionally reappears in small roles, including a handful of guest appearances alongside his former on-screen father, Tim Allen, on the sitcom Last Man Standing. But he has never chased back the level of fame he had as a teenager. In an industry built almost entirely around visibility, he's one of the rare examples of someone who simply opted out, on his own terms, and never looked back. That was a story of deliberate, calm choice. But the next one is about a boy whose fame was so intense, so early, that walking away wasn't nearly as simple. Number 7, Haley Joel Osment, the boy who saw dead people. At just 4 years old, Haley Joel Osment was discovered by a talent scout in, of all places, a furniture store. That chance encounter led to a Pizza Hut commercial, then a role as Forrest Gump's young son in the 1994 Best Picture winner Forrest Gump. He wasn't even old enough for elementary school, and he'd already appeared in one of the most celebrated films of the decade. But nothing prepared audiences, or Osment himself, for what came next. In 1999, at age 11, he starred opposite Bruce Willis in The Sixth Sense as Cole Sear, a boy who could see and communicate with the dead. The film became a cultural phenomenon, and Osment's performance earned him an Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actor, making him one of the youngest nominees in that category in Oscar history. His character's line, "I see dead people," became so iconic that it later landed on the American Film Institute's list of the 100 greatest movie quotes of all time. For a brief moment, Osment wasn't just a successful child actor. He was considered, by critics and industry insiders alike, one of the most talented actors working in Hollywood, period, regardless of age. He followed up with major roles in Steven Spielberg's AI Artificial Intelligence and the drama Pay It Forward, cementing his status as a leading young talent. And that's exactly where the paradox begins. Osment peaked so high, so young, that there was nowhere obvious left for the industry to take him. He later spoke openly about how tense and difficult those years actually were behind the scenes. He described the mid-2000s tabloid culture in Los Angeles as predatory and aggressive toward young celebrities. So he made a quiet decision. He moved to New York and enrolled at NYU's Tisch School of the Arts, spending roughly the next 15 years living largely away from the entertainment industry's center of gravity. He never fully vanished. He kept working steadily in independent films, television, and voice acting, including a recurring role on HBO's Silicon Valley. But the sheer scale of fame he experienced at 11 years old never quite returned in the same form. And here's what makes his story stand out from most others on this list. Osment insists he doesn't regret any of it. He said, in his own words, that acting is still a job he genuinely enjoys, uncertainty and all, and that at every point where he could have walked away entirely, he chose to stay in the profession anyway. The next story is about a boy whose fame turned into something far darker, not because of his own choices, but because of how audiences treated him. Number 6, Jake Lloyd, When Fans Blamed a Child. In 1999, after 16 years of waiting, Star Wars fans finally got a new film, The Phantom Menace, the long-anticipated prequel to the original trilogy. 10-year-old Jake Lloyd was cast as young Anakin Skywalker, the future Darth Vader, in what was arguably one of the most anticipated child roles in movie history. Overnight, his face became recognizable to essentially every Star Wars fan on the planet. By any normal measure, this should have been the beginning of an extraordinary career. Instead, it became something closer to a cautionary tale about what happens when adult disappointment gets directed at a child. The Phantom Menace received a deeply divided reception, and a significant portion of longtime fans were unhappy with the direction of the film. But instead of directing that frustration at the writers or the director, a disturbing number of fans turned their criticism directly onto the 10-year-old actor playing the role. Lloyd became, for years afterward, something of a punchline within fan communities, mocked, in a way that had nothing to do with anything actually within his control as a child performer following adult direction on a film set. Lloyd continued acting in a handful of projects after The Phantom Menace, but by the time he was a teenager, he had made the decision to leave the industry entirely. He later spoke publicly about how the sheer volume of criticism and mockery tied to the role played a direct role in that decision. Imagine being old enough to read the internet, but not old enough to understand why strangers hated you for something you didn't write, direct, or produce. After stepping away from acting, Lloyd's life became almost entirely private. In 2015, reports emerged of an arrest connected to a police pursuit, followed by subsequent mental health treatment. His family has since asked media and fans to respect his privacy, and there has been very little public information about him since. Lloyd's story is a genuinely important reminder before we move on. Behind every performance fans criticize online, there was often a real child simply doing the job adults hired them to do. Okay, quick pause. If you haven't hit like yet, now's genuinely the moment, because everything from here gets bigger. We've got a childhood sitcom role that turned into a $100 million fashion empire. A young actress who walked away from Hollywood entirely, on her own terms, and never looked back. One of the most dramatic public comebacks in modern celebrity history. And finally, story number one. A case so significant that it actually reshaped how the entertainment industry thinks about protecting children on set. Let's keep going. Number 5. The Olsen Twins. From children's television to $100 million a year. Mary-Kate and Ashley Olsen were literally babies when they began alternating in the role of Michelle Tanner on the sitcom Full House, sharing the part because infant labor laws limited how long any single child could be on set. By the time the show ended in 1995, the twins were already far more than child actresses. Through their own company, Dual Star Entertainment Group, they had built an entire media empire around themselves. Direct-to-video movies, TV films, merchandise, and eventually a magazine, reportedly generating hundreds of millions of dollars in retail sales throughout the late 90s. But the real turning point in their story happened quietly, almost without fanfare, in the mid-2000s. As other former child stars were chasing bigger film roles or reality television deals, the Olsen twins did something almost nobody expected. They walked away from mainstream acting almost entirely and pivoted hard into fashion. In 2006, they launched a high-end label that would eventually become known as The Row, a brand built around minimalist, extremely expensive design rather than anything resembling their child star image. The gamble paid off in a way few outsiders predicted. By the early 2020s, industry estimates placed the Row's annual sales at around $100 million, positioning the Olsens among the wealthiest women in entertainment, not because of a movie franchise, but because of a fashion house they built themselves, largely out of public view. Today, the twins almost never give interviews and rarely appear in traditional media at all. It's a striking transformation. These were two of the most photographed children in America throughout the entire 1990s, their every public appearance documented in exhaustive detail. And yet they've managed to become two of the most private, media-verse businesswomen in modern entertainment. In an industry that usually demands constant visibility to stay relevant, the Olsens prove that stepping back from the cameras can actually be the smartest business decision of all. That's a story of a successful, deliberate transformation. But the next one is about someone who chose to leave the spotlight for a completely different reason. Number 4. Mara Wilson, the girl who chose to leave. Mara Wilson's run through the mid-1990s is genuinely remarkable when you look at it all at once. She played the youngest daughter in Mrs. Doubtfire opposite Robin Williams. She starred as Susan Walker in the 1994 remake of Miracle on 34th Street. And then, in 1996, she landed the title role in Matilda, based on the Roald Dahl novel, a film that has since become a genuine childhood classic for an entire generation, by any measure. Wilson was one of the most in-demand child actresses in the entire country. And then, while still a teenager, in the very early 2000s, she simply stepped away. Not because of a scandal, not because a studio dropped her. She made the decision herself. What makes Wilson's story genuinely different from almost everyone else on this list is what she did after leaving. Rather than staying quiet about the experience, she became one of the most candid, thoughtful voices on the actual difficulties of growing up inside the entertainment industry. She's written extensively, including a memoir about her experience with childhood fame, about the intense pressure placed on young performers, the near total loss of ordinary privacy, and the deeply unrealistic expectations adults often project onto children who happen to be famous. Instead of continuing to chase roles, Wilson enrolled at NYU to study playwriting, building an entirely separate creative career around her own writing rather than someone else's script. She's occasionally returned to acting, most notably through voice work on shows like BoJack Horseman and Big Hero 6. The series, but always in small, deliberate doses, entirely on her own schedule. Next up is a story that started with just as much promise as Wilson's, but went in a dramatically different direction. A genuine, very public roller coaster of collapse and comeback. Number 3, Lindsay Lohan, The Fall That Seemed Final. In 1998, an 11-year-old Lindsay Lohan landed a dual role in the remake of The Parent Trap, playing twin sisters separated at birth, an incredibly demanding part for any actor, let alone a child working essentially two roles at once. It made her an instant star. She followed it up with Freaky Friday in 2003, and then, in 2004, the film that would come to define an entire generation's sense of humor. Mean Girls, a movie so quotable that lines from it still circulate online literally every single day. 2 decades later, at her peak, entertainment journalists routinely described Lohan as one of the most talented, most bankable young actresses working in Hollywood. She had box office pull, critical respect, and a fan base that spanned multiple demographics. Then, starting in the mid to late 2000s, things began to unravel in an extremely public way. Over the following years, Lohan faced multiple arrests connected to driving under the influence, a series of legal proceedings that played out extensively in tabloid media, and several stays in rehabilitation facilities. It became, without much exaggeration, one of the most heavily covered celebrity stories of that entire decade. Her every court appearance turned into a media event. By the early 2010s, a significant portion of the public had quietly written off any possibility of a real comeback. Here's the twist almost nobody saw coming. In the 2020s, Lohan reemerged, not through some gritty prestige drama meant to prove she was a serious actress again, but through a series of lighthearted, big-budget Netflix romantic comedies. And audiences responded with genuine warmth. Viewers who had grown up watching Mean Girls and Freaky Friday showed up for her comeback films in large numbers, treating her return less like a redemption story and more like an old friend showing back up right on time. Lohan proved that a very public fall doesn't automatically mean a permanent ending. But the next story shows just how difficult and how legally complicated the road back can actually be. Hashtag to Amanda Bynes, 9 years under someone else's control. At 10 years old, Amanda Bynes became one of the breakout stars of Nickelodeon's sketch comedy show All That. By 19, she'd already headlined her own program, The Amanda Show, and successfully transitioned into a string of major theatrical films, including What a Girl Wants, She's the Man, and later Hairspray and Easy A. For over a decade, Bynes looked like one of the very few former child stars who had managed a completely clean, seamless transition into adult stardom. Then, starting around 2012, everything shifted, and quickly. Bynes faced multiple arrests over the following 2 years, including charges related to driving under the influence and, later, drug possession. Her public behavior during this period became a constant subject of tabloid coverage. And then something happened to Bynes that happened to literally no one else on this entire list. In 2013, a court granted her mother conservatorship over her, a legal arrangement that gave another adult direct control over Bynes's finances and many of her personal decisions, based on concerns about her ability to manage her own affairs. This wasn't a temporary intervention. It lasted nearly 9 full years, only ending in 2022. Think about that for a moment. For nearly a decade, a grown woman who had been financially independent since childhood needed another person's legal permission for major decisions about her own life. It's one of the starkest examples in modern entertainment of just how severely a child star's adult struggles can escalate. Since the conservatorship ended, Bynes has deliberately chosen a much quieter path. Rather than attempting an immediate return to acting, she trained and became licensed in cosmetology, and she now lives a considerably more private life in Los Angeles, focused primarily on her own health and stability rather than a comeback narrative. And now, story number 1. A boy so famous that describing him as recognized everywhere almost undersells it, and whose experience permanently changed how Hollywood talks about protecting kids on set. Hashtag one Macaulay Culkin, the most famous child on Earth. In 1990, a 10-year-old boy from New York City became, arguably, the single most famous child on the planet. Home Alone, a modestly budgeted comedy about a boy accidentally left behind while his family flies to Paris for Christmas, became a genuine cultural phenomenon and, for years, one of the highest-grossing comedies in film history. Macaulay Culkin wasn't just a successful child actor after that. He was recognized by people who had never even watched a single one of his movies. His face, frozen in that now iconic scream, became one of the most reproduced images of the entire decade. That level of fame came with a price tag most people never think about. As Culkin's earnings climbed into the tens of millions of dollars, his parents became locked in an extended, highly publicized legal battle with each other over control of his finances and his career decisions. It became one of the first major, widely covered examples of just how vulnerable a child star can be, not to the industry itself, but to the adults inside their own family who are supposed to be protecting them. After reaching adulthood, Culkin largely stepped back from major film roles for years, appearing only occasionally and largely avoiding the kind of constant public presence that had defined his childhood. And when he did eventually return to the public eye in a major way, he did it in the single most unexpected fashion imaginable. In 2013, he co-founded a comedy band called Pizza Underground, a group that performed parody covers of Velvet Underground songs, but with every lyric rewritten to be about pizza. It sounds like a joke, because it was designed to be one. Culkin later described the project with total self-awareness about how absurd it was, and the band quietly disbanded a couple of years later. Since then, Culkin has taken a noticeably different approach to his own fame, leaning into the absurdity of it rather than running from it. He's appeared in self-aware commercials that directly reference his Home Alone image, popped up in occasional acting roles on his own terms, and built a life that looks almost nothing like the constant spotlight of his childhood. He's in a long-term relationship with actress Brenda Song, and the two have children together, living what by most accounts is a considerably quieter, more grounded life than his 10-year-old self could have imagined. And that's exactly why his story earns the #1 spot on this list. Culkin didn't just survive arguably the most intense childhood fame of the entire 1990s. He found a genuine way to take control back, on his own terms, decades later, which, as you've seen throughout this entire video, is something not every child star gets the chance to do. 8 different childhoods. 8 completely different outcomes. Some of them walked away deliberately, the moment they realized fame wasn't serving them anymore. Some built entire business empires out of the visibility they'd been handed as children. Some went through genuinely difficult, very public years before finding their way back. And at least one turned the sheer absurdity of his own fame into something that's uniquely, unmistakably his. If there's one thing this list makes clear, it's that childhood fame isn't a single story with a predictable ending. It's not automatically a tragedy, and it's not automatically a guarantee of lifelong success either. It's simply an extraordinarily early, extraordinarily public start to a life that each of these people ultimately had to figure out on their own terms, usually while the entire world was still watching. If this video kept you here till the end, that alone tells me it landed. Hit subscribe, drop a like, and let me know in the comments which story surprised you the most. And tell me who you want to see covered next time, because trust me, this list could easily have been 20 names long. See you in the next one.